A holy place is never empty. At the end of the 19th century, the most prominent Ukrainian historian Hrushevsky began his work, a figure that deserves close consideration. The great Soviet encyclopedia of 1953 year is frankly harsh to him. Grushevsky, Mikhail Sergeyevich. 1866, 1934 years. The leader of the reactionary bourgeois nationalist trend in Ukrainian historiography, the ideologist of the Ukrainian counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. Actually, it wasn't always in the Soviet Union that Grushevsky was so harshly stamped. There was a time when he was treated completely differently, but let's take it in order. Mikhail Grushevsky, who remained a subject of the Russian Empire until 1917th year, was listed as a nobleman, but the nobility was freshly baked, served by his father. The ancestors, according to the research of Alexia Elderberry, were entirely small clergy from Under Chigorin, not even rural priests, wildlings, sexton, church non-commissioned officers, so to speak. He received his education in Russia, where at the age of 28, he defended his thesis for the academic title of Master of History, but did not pursue a scientific career in Russia, as Oles Buzina suggests, most likely due to the fact that the competition was great, and it would have been difficult for a novice historian, who had absolutely nothing yet glorified himself, to compete with the stars of that time like Kluchevsky, Solovyev. It is quite possible, I will add on my own behalf, that the reason is also that Grushevsky, as subsequent events showed, was imbued with the ideas of self-identity. Anyway, he did not hesitate to leave for the Austrian city of Lviv, where the Imperial Royal Department of the History of Ukraine had just been opened at the university there, which the Austrians interpreted in a very peculiar way, but more on that later. Grushevsky became a professor of the said department. The Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires were then in some ways a mirror image. In Vienna, they intended, with luck, to cut off Ukraine from Russia, make it a kingdom, and put someone from the Archduke on the throne, into princes of the blood, which there were enough in the empire. Russia had the same plans for the Czech Republic, which belonged to the Austrians, an independent Slavic kingdom under the scepter of one of the many Romanovs. True, Russia admittedly lagged far behind in the ideological and propaganda support of this ideal, but the meticulous Austrians approached the matter much more seriously. More about their work a little later, but for now, I will say one thing: the Austrians desperately needed not untalented scribes, who were able to interpret Ukrainian history in the right way. By betting on Grushevsky, they did not make a fortune at all. As if by magic, Grushevsky's numerous assistants, who helped in the collection of scientific materials, appeared from nowhere and received good complaints. However, informed people already at that time believed that this was a magic wand. In reality, it is called much more official and sushi. Grushevsky creatures. Most of all, his historical exercises resembled those used by one of the heroes of the Polish writer Kanopnicka's children's fairy tale about dwarfs and the orphan Maris. The scholar-scribe was a weirdo who enjoyed serious respect among his fellow countrymen for the virtuosity of his pen. What he saw, what he heard, he wrote down correctly, and what he did not see and did not hear, he invented so perfectly that when reading this book, everyone's hearts were filled with joy. He was the first to prove that dwarfs smaller than Pyaga are actually giants who purposely shrink so that they spend less cloth on kaftan cloaks, because now everything has become kind. Grushevsky had it even easier. He wrote only about what he had not seen or heard. By the way, he knew the Ukrainian language poorly and wrote in it right disgusting, clumsy, illiterate, sometimes building the most imaginative and verbal constructions. Even his ideological supporters, admirers, associates, sometimes clutched their heads and complained openly about the immense boredom that engulfs when you read his creation. There are a great many facts given, but not a single Ariadne thread among them. In addition, scattering, chewing dozens of times literally the same thing. I have not read Grushevsky's entire works on the move, but I can judge from the extensive quotations given in books about him. Really clumsiness on clumsiness. That Grushevsky found nothing. In the end, he sculpted the monumental 3-volume work, The History of Ukraine Rus. Moreover, we must pay tribute to him, the bearded troll Alexei Buzina, the crafty cunning grandfather. The Ukrainian poet Alexander Oles did not invent anything from himself. He simply wrote down as Ukrainians everyone who came across him while studying ancient and medieval history. That's enough, and the readers are now facing the most natural Ukrainian. In the 6th century AD, the tribes of the Ants lived between the Dnieper and the Dniester. In fact, not everything is clear about their origin until now, but the Romaic historian Procopius of Caesarea considered them to be a people related to the Slavs. This was enough for Hrushevsky, and he, without batting an eye, depicted the Ants as an ancient Ukrainian tribe that gave rise to modern Ukrainians. The Ants disappeared from the historical arena more than 1,000 years ago and could not protest for purely technical reasons. Grushevsky worked hard. He confidently declared the founders of ancient Russia, Oleg, Igor and Rurik, to be Ukrainian princes, although, according to the tale of bygone years, they had nothing to do with Slavs at all, because they were Varangians. However, Grushevsky arrogantly declared, the chronicler was wrong. He knew better from the 19th century. He further wrote that Anna Yaroslavna, the Kievan princess who became the Queen of France, was actually a pure-blooded Ukrainian, and was called Hannah, that the original language of ancient Russia was just Ukrainian, that ancient Rus was actually Ukraine, but during its decline, the name Rus was appropriated by the great Russian people. So, naturally, Muscovites took a glorious name and appropriated it. It should be noted that Grushevsky's evidence base has always been bad. More precisely, nothing at all. He simply saw it that way and continued to insert Ukrainian instead of Russian, with a steady hand at any opportunity. The relocation of a part of the former Zaporozhye army to the Kuban is called the Ukrainian colonization of the Kuban. The development of Crimea by the Russians, the Ukrainian colonization of Crimea, and so on, in the same spirit. None of the wingmen has ever given a clear answer to the insidious question. Why is it that every single epic telling about the Grand Duke so red sun on Kiev Vladimir and his glorious heroes were recorded by folklore collectors not just in Russia, in the north of Russia, near the Pomers, where even Hrushevsky did not dare to place Ukrainians? In Ukraine, there were only Cossack songs Duma, telling exclusively about Cossack everyday life. The problem is also that there has never been any Kievan Rus. Neither Russian chroniclers nor foreign travelers know it. Everywhere both of them have simply Rus. With a great stretch, it is still possible to call the possessions of Vladimir the Baptist Kievan Rus, but after his death, what Grushevsky himself melancholically calls the agony of the Kievan state began. After the death of Vladimir's son Yaroslav, whom contemporaries never called wise, for the first time he was so named by Karamzin. Already in the 19th century, in 1541st year, his sons, in a fierce struggle for power, divided their grandfather's inheritance into 6 principalities and founded 5 dynasties. Moreover, Kiev has ceased to be considered senior. Seniority passed to Vladimir, where Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky of Kiev moved in 1169th year, leaving Kiev to his son. The Vladimir Suzdal Principality has since become known as the Great One. Even a Grushevsky could not pass by such an obvious fact, let alone deny it, but he gave his own interpretation of events. According to him, the Suzdal dynasty harbored the most villainous designs. Presenting Kiev to various younger relatives, they try to keep them and Kiev in proper respect, and deliberately contributes to the decline of Kiev. What can I add here? It is quite possible that the Suzdal dynasty really deliberately weakened Kiev, a common thing in feudal feuds. However, even Grushevsky in this particular case did not dare to sing out of habit about the machinations of evil Muscovites. Some irrefutable facts still had to be taken into account in order not to look like a complete dreamer in the eyes of fellow historians. Moscow at that time had no independent significance. It was a tiny village in the wilderness. It was only in the middle of the 13th century that it became a separate principality, under the rule of Alexander Nevsky's brother Mikhail Tversky, and Ivan Khalida moved the Great Table from Vladimir to Moscow even later, in 1328 year. Grushevsky consoled himself by declaring the famous battle with the Tatars on Khalkha in 1223 year, a battle in which the Ukrainian princes participated. The sad situation with those very proofs was aggravated by the fact that there are no chronicles in the Ukrainian language. Both the chronicles and the inscriptions scratched on the walls, called graffiti by historians, are made in Russian. However, Grushevsky tried to explain this from his bell tower. And the absence of Ukrainian texts, and the fact that epics about the Kievan antiquity were preserved only in Russia, he explained by the fact that until the half of the 12th century, the great Russian lands were more closely dependent on Kiev. That is, mainly works of the 11th and first half of the 12th century and beyond were preserved here, that is, in Great Russia. Thus, we have very little material for judging the literary movement in the Ukrainian lands in the second half of the 12th and in the 13th centuries, and for the previous time, in no case can we rely on the completeness of the available material. The logic is frankly lame. If written monuments and epics have been preserved in the colonies, why are there absolutely none left in the metropolis, in Ukraine? The available material, which Hrushevsky mentions, does not just suffer from incompleteness, it is absent altogether. Russian, interspersed with local dialect phrases, Grushevsky himself cites a petition of the Kiev gentry to the Polish king, filed in 1571 year, and concerned just the preservation of the Russian language. This document, perhaps, is worth quoting in its entirety. Especially also His Royal Grace, our gracious Sir, we ask that the message of the same, universals, constitutions, every matter after the oath, the privileges of His Royal Grace at the end of the Union. We are talking about the treaty between Poland and Lithuania, which turned them into a single state. Only Russian letters and written language were sent, because our fathers did not teach us another language from childhood, and there is no Polish school in Kiev, and when they send messages to His Royal Grace written in Polish letters, with an admixture of Latin words, we cannot understand them, as well as the privilege of the unity of the land of Kiev. In Polish letters it is written, we ask His Royal Grace that it be rewritten in Russian, and with the state seal and signature of His Royal Grace our gracious Sir, be given to us with His own hand. The translation into modern Russian is mine. Indeed, the signature of Khmelnytsky, and his seal, and the seal of Mazepa, and the inscription on the Cossack banner, and even the seal of the Zaporozhian army, all this is in the purest Russian. The word Palenka should not confuse anyone either. This is just a local word for one of the military units of the Sich, something like a separate battalion of a later time. The piquancy is that Grushevsky himself cites the text of this agreement in his book. He dealt with the above petition simply. As usual, wherever the word Russian occurs, Ukrainian is added in parentheses. But I couldn't do anything about the seals and inscriptions, citing them without any comments. Declaring it in Ukrainian would simply mean disgracing myself. In the fact that in the 18th century, most Galicians did not speak Ukrainian but in Russian, Grushevsky habitually sees the evil machinations of enemies. However, this time it's not the evil Muscovites, but the damn Laics. The Polish gentry managed to gain influence on the Galician administration and to prevent the revival of the local Ukrainian nationality. Having never existed, it began already from the 90s of the 18th century to frighten the government with a sign of the Russian irredenta. The movement for independence. The term was used in relation not only to the Slavic lands, trying to convince him that the Russian language is an adverb of Great Russian, that Russians uniates gravitate to orthodoxy and the like. A song that was sung with unflagging success until very recently. Uniates, followers of the Brest Ecclesiastical Union of 1596th year, on the unification of the Orthodox and Catholic churches with submission to the Pope. What Grushevsky disparagingly calls a song is in fact, as we will see a little later, a description of the real state of affairs. For some reason, this time, even Grushevsky kept the words Russians and the Russian language intact, contrary to his usual custom, without getting Ukrainian everywhere in brackets. Why did he show unusual tolerance for the word Russian this time? This mystery is great. In another place, Hrushevsky again has to admit even more melancholically. Kiev Metropolitan Gavril Kremenetsky defines the Ukrainian language as a vernacular, ancient, local, mixed dialect with Polish and Slavic and nothing more. And then, a more attentive observer of the folk Ukrainian language seemed to be an interesting but dying phenomenon, and the author of the first grammar of the folk language, Pavlovsky 1818th year. He motivated his work with purely antique motives, calling the Ukrainian language neither alive nor dead, a disappearing adverb. It must be that Pavlovsky is another secret agent of the Muscovites. But seriously, the point is simply that as they became closer and closer to the Russians, the Little Russians simply gradually got rid of purely local dialect words. About the stunning discoveries of Grushevsky, Russian historians twisted their finger at the temple, and sometimes used completely non-parliamentary expressions in private statements, which did not bother the bearded troll at all. He enthusiastically composed his fantasy version of Ukrainian history, which had an extremely positive feedback from the Austro-Hungarian customer, who was also an undoubted sponsor. By the 1914th year, Grushevsky, who had not yet finished writing an epic-making work, again, at the wave of a certain magic wand, acquired a lot of real estate both in Austria-Hungary and in Russia. A Carpathian estate, a villa in Lviv, but most importantly, a huge 6-story apartment building in Kiev. That is a house in which the owner himself does not live, renting apartments for rent, and with it, a 2-story wing, more like a decent-sized mansion. It cannot be said that the professors were paid a miserable salary, but still, it was certainly not enough to swing like that. The Kiev house, by the way, was designed by one of the most expensive architects of the early 20th century, Grushevsky, and this huge building was built together with the wing in just 2 years, which again requires serious regular investments. I built it myself, I know. Naturally, cynical people even then asked a reasonable question: where did the firewood come from? Grushevsky innocently explained that he had received an inheritance from his father, but they did not believe him well, knowing that the late father was not a rich man. A little ahead of myself, I will clarify, I confess not without malice, that Grushevsky lost all this grace. In 1918th year, the estate turned out to be on the border between Romania and the newborn Czechoslovakia. Lviv was occupied by Poles, and in the bloody mess of that time, it was extremely difficult to restore their rights to real estate, and the Kiev house burned down. Revolutionary sailors from an armored train, who accidentally dropped into Kiev, shied at him with a shell. There is only one wing left. For his labors, Grushevsky became bronzed in the truest sense of the word. In 1904th year, a group of his fans, in modern terms, proposed to install a bronze bust of him in the Lviv Scientific Society named after Shevchenko, in commemoration of 10 years of, if I may say so, scientific activity in Lviv. The professor, modestly lowering his eyes, agreed, and his bust was displayed at the Department of History for 10 years. In 1914, when the Russian army occupied Lviv, he most mysteriously disappeared somewhere. The disappearance of the bronze statue is still shrouded in mystery. There were no reception points for non-ferrous metal scrap at that time, and as prey, he was no good to anyone. In the same year, with the outbreak of war, Grushevsky, who had so wisely remained a Russian citizen all this time, quickly returned to Russia. It was somehow inappropriate for a Russian citizen to remain among the newly made enemies in the person of the Austrians. In Russia, he was very quickly swept away by Russian military counterintelligence, which had accumulated a lot of interesting compromising material on the professor. Grushevsky was suspected not only of playing tricks with the Austrian and German secret services, but also of direct participation in the formation of military units of Ukrainian independent fighters, the so-called Sich Streltsy. They were formed by the Austrians, but the Germans have long been in the share. Even the Iron Chancellor Bismarck said, "Russia's power can only be undermined by the separation of Ukraine from it. It is necessary not only to tear off, but also to oppose Ukraine to Russia. To do this, you only need to find and nurture traitors among the elite, and with their help, change the self-consciousness of one part of the great people to such an extent that they will hate everything Russian, hate their kind without realizing it. Everything else, it's a matter of time." In the 19th century, statesmen did not bother with political correctness unknown at that time. What they thought, they talked about. Prokopenko quotes the memoirs of the general of the Russian army Romanovsky. Despite the fact that Grushevsky and his associates have furnished their activities with great secrecy, the Russian general staff managed to collect exhaustive evidence of their relations with Germany during the summer. Initially, attention was drawn to the fact that during the exchange of disabled prisoners of war, the Germans began to transfer perfectly healthy people, mainly natives of Little Russia, to Russia. Observation and interviews of them managed to establish that they were sent by the Germans to promote Ukrainian separatism, and upon arrival in Kiev, had to receive instructions from special agents grouped around the newspaper Novaya Rada, led by a certain Chikolenko, Hrushevsky's closest employee. By the way, the activities of the commemorated Lviv Scientific Society named after Shevchenko have been financed from secret funds by the German General Staff since 1907 year. Grushevsky spent only a few months behind bars, after which he was released, and they treated him surprisingly gently. Instead of prison or Siberia where he belonged, he was simply sent into exile to Simbirsk, and then to Kazan, according to other sources, and even to Moscow. The reasons for such amazing softness have remained unknown. Either the exhaustive evidence turned out to be not so exhaustive, or Grushevsky's great friends, Russian liberal intellectuals, who by that time had turned into a serious and vociferous force that had a great influence on the notorious public opinion, and in addition had learned to masterfully blackmail the government on various occasions. Or maybe the professor was vulgarly turned over and pumped out a lot of interesting information. The case in the practice of special services is common. Whatever the case, the bearded troll, we can safely say, got off with a slight fright. Let's step back a few decades, fast forward to Galicia, in which the Austrians, and later the Germans who joined the share, tried to create the purest Ukrainian language. Now Galician, perhaps, is indeed a special language. I can judge from personal experience. In the 2005 year in Kiev, at a book fair, I got into conversation with a young charming Galician woman, as it turned out a little later, a sophomore student. At first, the conversation frankly came to a dead end, solely because she did not understand my Ukrainian well, and I just as poorly understood her Galician. I switched to Polish, then only the conversation went well. Out of sincere curiosity, he asked what Ukrainian was not taught in schools in Galicia. Charming Panna Ivanovna, as it turned out, for the first time in her life, who came to Vyshit, that is, to the east, on the left bank, from her native places, located even much to the west of Lviv, waved her pen inimitably and told with a clear smile, "They taught of course, but that's such an officiousness. We have enough from our own language." But that's now. There were times when most Galicians had never heard of any such language of their own. Moreover, the pro-Russian sentiment was so strong that the first monuments to Pushkin appeared even earlier than in Russia, for the first time in Galician villages. The very first one was in the village of Velichki, in 1887th year. Russophile sentiments became stronger after 1849th year, when Russian troops passed through Galicia, moving to suppress the Hungarian rebellion. People saw that an army was coming, speaking almost the same language, praying in the same way. However, they did not doze in Vienna either. If the Poles at one time behaved stupidly colonialist in relation to the inhabitants of the regions of Little Russia that they inherited, then the Austrian politicians and special services turned out to be much smarter and more calculating. The strategic plan, designed for many years, was, as already mentioned, to tear Ukraine away from Russia and turn it into an independent power under the protectorate of Vienna. A simple military seizure in Vienna was well understood. It would not be possible to solve the case. The Russian Empire was a serious opponent. It was decided to go around, convince the Little Russians that they were a special people, with their own special language, having nothing in common with the Muscovite colonialists, and obliged to seek freedom. The Austrians worked slowly, with German meticulousness, according to the principle of a drop sharpening a stone. Numerous literary, geographical, historical, and cultural societies magically appeared all over Galicia, organized, as it was claimed, on the naked enthusiasm of selfless patriots of independent Ukraine. Although it is clear to a little understanding person, there is no way to achieve such a scale on naked enthusiasm. We need a lot of money. All these societies and partnerships were pulling tentacles into Russian Ukraine. The agitation and propaganda was not carried out wildly, quite skillfully, but with the perfection of a clockwork mechanism. Ukrainians are a separate people, enslaved by evil Muscovites. It is necessary to seek the creation of a free state where they will speak the purest Ukrainian language. Over time, in Galicia, this language was put into circulation almost officially, created on the basis of a local dialect, for historical reasons, saturated with Polonisms, or even borrowings from German. Galicia was under the rule of the Poles for more than 1 century, and during the next partition of Poland from 1772 to 1918th year, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Numerous magazines and newspapers began to be published in this language, mainly distributed free of charge to almost everyone, as in our time, advertising leaflets. That's just the mass of the Ukrainian population of Galicia and Bukovina stubbornly continued to be called Russians, called their language Russian, and categorically disavowed innovations. Free newspapers and magazines were often sent back with comments that did not require special translation. Don't you dare not send me such a Hades, filthy waste paper. The madman returns with a backward step. However, those who were certainly not insane bent their own. In addition to humanitarian organizations, a purely political one has already appeared, the essence of which is clear from the name: the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine. Grushevsky worked hard in Galicia, and there, with their full-fledged gold, the Germans also turned on, which they probably weren't particularly happy about in Vienna. They also read Bismarck there, and understood perfectly well that the Germans were trying first of all for themselves. But they did not dare to openly hinder their older brother. It was precisely this role that Germany assumed, which at one time, in the form of Prussia, inflicted serious military defeats on the Austrians and took leadership instead of Austria in the then North German alliance, which consisted of still independent German states. In the end, in 1890, 2 deputies of the Galician Simon from Russens, Romanchik and Vaknianin, declared that they were not Russians at all, but Ukrainians. 5 years later, the Ukrainian faction appeared in the media, that is, it was officially recognized as a political force of independence.